afternoon. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. It's been studied for decades. It's been the topic of much social media chatter. News coverage of Indigenous people or communities or issues. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, we are putting reporting on our people in focus. It's a media checkup, and we're not just looking outside the building. We're looking at ourselves, too. What's being done well and what needs to be improved. We want to hear what you think when you see stories of Indigenous people or issues in the media. How are these stories treated? How are the people portrayed? Do you feel that there is a fairness and a balance? Do you think that media even really understands sometimes what they're reporting or the context of it? Our phone lines are open. You can call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Getting us started on this topic, my first guest is from the Nipissing First Nation in Northern Ontario. Les Cucci is kind of a retired everything. He was a police officer, he taught at a college, he did economic development for his band, and he created the Seventh Generation Charity for the Union of Ontario Indians. That's just some of what his professional life looked like. He's now retired, and one of his hobbies includes combing through old newspaper stories for stories about Indigenous people. So earlier this week, I spoke with Mr. Cucci about some of what he's come across in his research. Thanks for joining me, Les. So about 7 years ago, you started your research. You started combing through old headlines and stories in the Toronto Star dating back to the early 1900s. Why did you start this research?
Well, I did it primarily because I was doing a community page on Facebook, and I was looking up to see if any of the relatives from this community were involved in any stories in the Toronto Star.
And so what are some of the headlines, what are some of the first things that you saw when you started combing through the old coverage that struck you?
Well, the very first thing that came up was a 1909 story about the Dokis First Nation, which is just across the lake from Nipissing First Nation. And they had received a timber settlement, and there was, I guess, a fair amount of money being given to each First Nation member. And the headline was that even the squaws were popular sweethearts with all this extra money.
And could you believe what you were reading at this point?
Not really, but you know, and then again, you know, when you think about it, it was 1909. But yeah, it shows where the seeds of racism started, probably.
What are some of the other, I know you had mentioned in talking earlier, you had mentioned some coverage about a controversial beach. Tell us about that. Well,
the one that really stuck out was the one in 1938 from Hitler, who questioned the Canadian government's care of the First Nations people in Canada.
Hitler's got a problem with how First Nations people are treated in Canada. What did you think when you read that?
Well, you know, sometimes I think Canadians think that we're in a, you know, the Eden, the perfect setup, but this clearly shows that, you know, even foreign governments could see what was going on here.
You had mentioned, too, something that I thought was interesting was the coverage of Grassy Narrows and the mercury poisoning there from the 70s. You know, I think a lot of people didn't know what was going on, but that had been covered. Was it covered fairly? Was it balanced? Was it fulsome?
Well, you know, the Grassy Narrows story struck me as something that, you know, it was 1970, and we're almost, 50 years beyond that, and we still haven't done anything to solve that problem. It's like I saw other ones involving Ipperwash, again in the 70s, where the government was supposed to return that property, and they didn't, and consequently we had a tragic death there.
What was the tone of these articles? Did you, as an Indigenous man reading these, did you feel that it was covered well, these issues?
Well, some of the articles, the early articles were very interesting in that there. Give you one example. There was a story of a young lady who was rescued from Lake Nipissing. During the rescue, or with the story about it, the story was all about the woman who survived 3 days. And at the very end of it, it talks about 3 Nipissing men who were out searching for her, who found her. But, you know, the story should have been about the heroes that were continually looking for her, as opposed to the way the story was written, totally unbalanced.
And, you know, I would ask you then now, so you can look back at the history of how our people and our issues are covered. How do you feel about how we're covered today as you read current headlines in various publications?
Well, I think you can see with the number of articles going back to 1909 how over time the press is beginning to change its position. Specifically, of course, the Toronto Star, because that's where most of the stories came from, although some of the stories were CP issued and picked up by the Toronto Star. But in the very beginning, you know, most of the stories were about people dying from tuberculosis, TB, starving. With very little government action, it appeared to be there was nothing going to happen as a result of these stories. And then in the 1970s, the Toronto Star did a full feature on what was going on in Kenora.
At what's now known as Anishinaabe Park.
Yeah, what I feel is, you know, these are heroes that they just seem to have fallen under fallen through the web, in a sense that, you know, we have heroes, but we don't look at the true heroes, the ones that decided to put their lives on the line, or, you know, spend their days blocking highways to prove a point. And I think those the bands from the Kenora area certainly got everybody listening to what they had to say.
Do you find nowadays that the media coverage of our people and our issues, is it more balanced than what you were seeing, you know, back in the 70s or earlier?
Well, I think it's a little more balanced, but you're still getting stories of tragedy that, you know, no matter how you balance it, it just comes out looking like that no one really cares at times, you know, especially when you get shootings out in the western provinces, and, you know, people are claiming right to protect and all this stuff, but it still doesn't deal with the real problems that are occurring.
What advice would you give to media who are covering Indigenous issues or Indigenous people? How to do better?
Well, my first thought is that we need to have more Native reporters. We have to have people who understand the perspective of First Nations before trying to write a story about First Nations. I think that would help a lot. I think we need to have these articles that I've collected put before journalism students and saying, how are you going to avoid things like this in your career?
Well, and where would people be able to see some of the headlines that you have collected? Where can we find them online?
Some of the headlines that I've collected, you know, there's there's just so many of them, but a couple of them really struck me, where young people would die either at a residential school or away from home, and they were sent home in cardboard boxes in the mail.
And are these visible on you have a Facebook page? Could you tell us about that?
Say that again, please. Sorry.
Can you tell us about your Facebook page where you have some of these articles available for people to see?
Well, some of the articles that I discovered, I found out that my grandfather, Joseph Commanda, and another band member, John Fisher, took fighting, hunting and treaty rights right up to the Ontario Supreme Court. And that I even found a picture of our family. In 1961, my mother had her first daughter after having 11 sons. So, you know, we was able to find some good stuff in there.
Amazing. Well, Les, thank you so much for taking the time to share some of your research with us, and you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my story.
It's great to talk to Mr. Cucci earlier this week. Some of the materials that the archival materials that he has found in his research of media coverage of Indigenous people or issues, you can find it on his Facebook page, First Nations Stories/Photos/Insights. We need to take a break, but when we come back, we are joined by APTN's first ever news director, Dan David, to chat about how Indigenous people are covered in the media now and how we got to this point. And Carmen Robertson, who co-wrote the book Seeing Red, A History of Natives in Canadian Newspapers. They've got lots to say on today's topic, so stay with us.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, or send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back. Let's go to social media now with our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko, to hear what some of you are saying about media headlines.
Thanks, Melissa. In an online poll, we asked, do you feel media fairly treats stories involving Indigenous people or perspectives? With over 600 responses, 6% of you answered yes, and 94% said no. We also asked online, what are your thoughts of media coverage of issues or events involving Indigenous people on Facebook? Tammy said, I don't believe there is enough positive coverage of Indigenous peoples in the news. Even small things on a daily basis are important. From Kev, pretty bad. All this talk of separation, not one article about how the treaties would prevent that. It's pretty disgraceful, actually. Should be utterly ashamed of missing such current events. Sharon said, more feel-good stories to inspire us all. Look into the chaos and find the good. Vanessa, as a non-Indigenous person, I really appreciate getting the additional perspective and attention to Indigenous issues and stories. On Twitter, Cindy Blackstock said, I would appreciate it if they stopped overusing Indigenous when the matter at hand affects only one group or nation. Lastly, from Maureen, the fact that you are asking this question is a sign that you are already doing what I believe will improve coverage, self-reflection, and taking constructive feedback. Thank you for all your responses. If you would like to add your opinion to our topic of conversation, here's how.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, or send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Some great comments from you guys, of course, not surprisingly. Dan David was APTN's first news director when we hit the airwaves 20 years ago. He's an award-winning journalist who has the benefit of seeing today's topic from all facets as a newsman, as a news consumer, and as a Mohawk. He joins us now from Kanesatake, Quebec. And joining us from our Ottawa bureau is Carmen Robertson. She is a Scottish Lakota professor of art history at Carleton University. Her research centers around contemporary Indigenous arts and constructions of indigeneity in popular culture. And in 2011, she co-authored a book, Seeing Red, a history, I have it here, a history of Natives in Canadian newspapers. So thank you both for joining us. We've got lots to discuss today. So let's start with even the past decade of media coverage. What sticks out to both of you? I'll start with you, Carmen.
Hi. Well, thanks for having me on. In the last decade, boy, it's been jam-packed. But I think probably one of the things that I am always looking for is, oh, this story seems to be the most important one. And then a month later or 2 months later, there's something else. But sadly, I think that what sticks out for me mostly right now is the Tina Fontaine coverage and also the Colton Bushy coverage. Mm-hmm. In addition to Idle No More, those really seem to be powerful and, kind of an unsettling media thread.
What specifically about the Tina Fontaine and the Colton Bushy, about the coverage, struck you as troubling?
Well, it's hard to pinpoint just one thing, but right away, the falling back on really troubling stereotypes, representing family in really destructive ways, falling to sort of a colonial and very racialized discourse that was going on in, I would say, across the board in the mainstream media.
And Dan, what in the past decade really struck you as wow-worthy in terms of media coverage of our people or our issues in just the past decade?
Those three things, but I'd also add that story coming out of South Central BC about land claims and about territorial rights. It's incredible that these stories are bubbling up from the regions as opposed to from the national office, you know, the national center in Ottawa. And it shows that these stories are bubbling up. They're actually coming into the public consciousness a lot more. Before, I don't think there would have been that amount of coverage, and I think that a lot of it is because of social media and how people are using it to get the word out that this is a story. This is important for the media to cover. Yeah. Pay attention.
And do you think, is the tone and the structure of this, I mean, I guess on one hand we could say the fact that the media is even interested in covering some of the things that are happening to us or that we're doing or that affect us, that's a positive, I guess. But are they doing it from a perspective where you can appreciate the scope, the tone, the structure? Are we making headway on that, I guess?
Well, following up on your previous guest, he was talking about the Ipperwash incident where Dudley George was killed by the Ontario Provincial Police, by a Master Sergeant there. Taking a look at the coverage there, for instance, before the shooting, it was pretty standard coverage. It was basically, you know, Canadian press, local reporters doing it. Nobody was talking to the occupiers, to the Indigenous people behind the barricades. They were going to official sources, mainly, occasionally going to the band office where they got bad information there as well. So they had the police, they had the government, and they had the band office, all of them giving a very poor representation of the occupiers who were there standing up for their rights. Mm-hmm. And for a just cause, too. They were not just, you know, claiming back land that had been stolen from them by the military, but they had... also, they were protecting a cemetery. They were protecting, you know, the spirits of their people, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. But that didn't come out until after the shooting, once people started looking at some of the back issues. And it was an example, I think, of what I call the body count coverage, where something happens and then the media comes in and all of a sudden it's a big story. And that's what happened with Dudley George, with the shooting at Ipperwash. It was only after he was shot and killed that the media really took attention and began to sift through some of the backstory and what happened, what led to the shooting.
Carmen, tell us about your rule of three. I remember that being an interesting portion of Seeing Red, and I think that it still applies to today's coverage.
Well, I think that the problem with media is it sees everything as happening for the first time ever. It has no historic memory, it seems as though. So things like Ipperwash that come up, and then we see, you know, Standing Rock, or what we see happening most recently in BC. Yeah. Those are all considered to be completely insulated incidents without understanding that there is a longer narrative and story leading up to events, and then of course a much longer unfolding after events. So during the events we get these stereotypes that pop up and continue to plague mainstream coverage. One of the things that's changing today is that there are more sources for news, so people aren't necessarily getting everything they know about an issue from mainstream press. And I think that's helping to create more balanced approaches.
Yeah. Dan, you, a longtime newsman, what, I'm curious your thoughts, we talked a little bit before the show about the people who make up newsrooms, what they lack, I guess, in terms of, that would help them to be better tellers of our story and better reflect our people. What do you see as the problems in these newsrooms?
Well, take a look at the examples that we've talked about. One of the first things that strikes is lack of any kind of curiosity about that burning fuse, what led up to the tragedy, what led up to all the attention. And a lot of reporters just look at it as a story, so they go in there and they cover the superficial part of the story, but they don't really do the digging behind it. What happened behind the story? Describe, the background information that people need to have in order to understand the issues and understand the history of this conflict. And this usually is conflict. Mm-hmm. The other thing, too, is the misrepresentation, the stereotypes that happen almost automatically. Mm-hmm. As journalists, we do it ourselves. We all boil down stories into easy, simple stereotypes, make it understandable to our various audiences. And that's a problem when it's these age-old, really rancid stereotypes that keep getting dredged up time after time after time. What I see with a lot of newsrooms is, especially with younger reporters, more inexperienced reporters, is they dredge up a whole lot of old wire copy or newspaper items and they print them out. And you're basically recycling old stereotypes over and over and over again, mm-hmm. as opposed to going in there with fresh eyes, get rid of that mindset and actually go in there with a sense of curiosity. What's going on? Who are these people? What's the story? And I see more and more of that happening these days, but it's still prevalent in most newsrooms.
Yeah. Well, and I know there's we all know about feeding the goat, as we call it in this business. It's you get in the morning and it's go, 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 go. You've got to meet a deadline. And I think that if you don't know and understand what you're talking about and what you're covering, it's very easy to just do the very superficial swoop by. But Dan, you had mentioned, in addition to just that kind of feeding the goat and being able to come in, dip in and do something superficially, there's really no reason for reporters to have to get it right if you aren't accountable to that community. You're not going back there for anything. You don't live, these aren't your people. How do we fix that?
You can't really, except make people a bit more aware that there are other communities out there. Indigenous people don't have political power. We don't have economic power. We're not people behind what drives the news business, which is advertising. So we have very little say except, to appeal to their sense of justice, to their sense of morality, what's right. And most often, that's the best thing that we can do with any journalist, any story, anywhere, anytime. If we can't pull the economic levers, if we can't really punish them or reward them economically, well, then we really have to appeal to their sense of justice. Yeah. There's nothing else.
Carmen, so you had done your research for your story, for your book that came out in 2011. I'm curious, what you found in your research before the book, and then what you see in the media since the book. Have you seen any improvement, or are you seeing a lot of the same things repeated and to no end or improvement?
Well, we did look at press reports from 1869 all the way to 2009, and sadly there wasn't a lot of change throughout that, and it was really difficult work to do to read that much negativity, and we went in assuming that there would be some major change, and we really didn't find it. Since 2011, since the book came out, even though it is assigned in a lot of journalism classrooms, which is great, and there has been some change, but there is a larger issue here where Canadians know very little about our colonial past and don't seem all that interested in even Googling things. So if you have a reporter who's got to get a story done quickly and he has no sense of the community or the issues that have plagued a place or the really positives that are going on there, they have a skewed perspective going in. And so I do see a repetition of much of that negative stereotype going on. And there was a recent New York Times story about Cape Dorset, I think, that really does continue that same stereotypical perspective in 2019.
Poverty porn.
Pardon, I'm sorry.
I said poverty porn. You just frame
Oh,
it as...
yes.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you specifically about that because your field is in contemporary Indigenous art, and then you've got this Cape Dorset story for people at home who, we're going to talk more about it in the next block, but for people at home who may not know what the story was, it was basically the New York Times sent a reporter to Cape Dorset talking about how art was supposed to save this Inuit community and how it didn't, and all of these awful things that continue to exist there. And just, I guess it's not so much that and I would ask you this, Carmen, what specifically bugged you about how that article was covered or how it was written or framed?
Well, there are so many things that really bothered me about it, but one of the things I found interesting is I also wrote a book about the way Anishinaabe artist Norval Morrisseau was represented in the press, and the kinds of stereotypes that were being repeated again and again in the 60s and 70s in relation to Morrisseau were cropping up also in this story, that the artist is uneducated, that what is she spending her money on, what are artists using their money for, what's happening in their home life, how are they dressed, things like that really have so little to do with the art.
Yeah, the tone. So Dan, APTN is now in its 20th year. I want to ask you, has APTN had any sort of an impact on the landscape media landscape in terms of how stories involving our people or our issues are covered?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, by example, going out there and having some sensitivities, background knowledge of the people, the communities, the histories, the societies, the cultures, the values. I mean, all of that stuff comes into play when an Aboriginal reporter goes into our own communities. We're not parachuting in and just looking for the quick hit. Although that does happen with a lot of Aboriginal journalists. But, we try to be sensitive because we are more accountable to them. When we screw up, we know about it instantly, right away. They're after us. Because we're talking about our own families. And you can't do that. You can't screw up with that family.
And I think APTN understands that, but
we have had a huge impact.
And I know that there's a call oftentimes like, we just need more Indigenous journalists out there telling stories. And I know that APTN is sensitive, like you said, to we are accountable because these are our people, these are our families, these are our communities. Do you see that an Indigenous journalist who's working in a non-Indigenous, a mainstream media outlet, what challenges would you see for them? I mean, does the employer even care about the accountability to that community? Or is it just all about still feeding the goat from this non-Indigenous perspective? It's just about feeding it to the masses?
It's always about feeding the goat. It's always. It's always about feeding the goat. It's always about meeting the deadline, doing a certain number of stories in a certain amount of weight. There are always fences put up on either side. What we try to do with Indigenous journalism, though, is try to look at the wider perspective in our own communities. It comes natural to a non-Indigenous journalism covering stories in Regina or Winnipeg or Montreal, where they look at the community as a whole. But when it comes to Indigenous communities, they look at the issue specifically, and they don't look beyond that. So I compare it to the standoff here at Oka. The barricades, the reporters were so focused on the people with the masks and the camouflage and the weapons at the barricades that they almost completely ignored the entire community that was behind, that was inside. And it took a long, long time to get them interested in anything to do with us here. So I compare non-Indigenous journalism to that.
Okay, we're almost out of time.
Still today, that's basically the way that we're covered.
I'm curious, Carmen, what's a quick and easy fix that you would recommend to either reporters or to editors assigning these stories? What would you like to see done?
Well, I agree. I think context is a real key here, that just jumping into an issue and looking for the flashpoint is only one part of the story. The larger community is really important, and Indigenous journalists aren't always given the opportunity to give the backstory. They may even know about that. So I think that it's important for editors to understand that there are different ways to lead stories, and that viewers, I think, would enjoy consuming consuming a different kind of news than just the sensationalism that they're getting.
Yeah. Well, and we're seeing a little bit of that now. I'd like to give a shout out to Creason over at CTV Regina. He does really well at this, right? Well, thank you guys both for taking...
He's a former student.
Oh, are you kidding? Oh, well, yeah, small world. But thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to talk about this. It's an important issue, and we all want to do better at what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Melanie.
Take care.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, we have to take another break, but when we come back, we are going to get more into that New York Times story that we just talked about that invoked the rage of Indigenous journalists, and not just Indigenous journalists, I guess, too. What did the paper do wrong, and who is holding them to account? That is when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Graham Lee Brewer is a contributing editor for Indigenous Affairs at High Country News, and he's a board member of the Native American Journalists Association. He's joining us to have this discussion from Norman, Oklahoma. And Francine Compton, she's a producer here at APTN. She puts out APTN National News for you every single day. She's been in the media for 2 decades and has recently joined the Native American Journalists Association's Board of Directors as the watchdog and advocacy organization expands its reach into Canada. Hey, Graham. Got a little bit of
I'm sorry, I can't.
We've got a little bit of a delay there.
Oh, I can hear you now. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. So let's start by talking about that article that was in the New York Times about how art was supposed to save the Inuit community of Cape Dorset. Naja called out this article for its stereotypical portrayal of Inuit. Graham, what did the New York Times get wrong?
Well, I think the whole framing of the story was very problematic. As some of your guests alluded to earlier, that I think it's a problem when non-Indigenous people report on Indigenous communities and aren't very familiar with them, their histories, and I guess the context of how we got here as a country. Canada and America, we have a very similar backstory in terms of colonization and settler colonialism, and I think that those histories, those pieces of context that help a reader understand how a community came to be experiencing the things that reporter is there covering are often lacking, and that usually starts with the reporter themselves. A lot of those things we don't get to learn in our public school system. To give you for instance, I grew up here in Oklahoma, a place that was once deemed Indian territory, is home to 39 federally recognized tribes. I went to high school in Norman, Oklahoma, one of the most progressive cities in the state. And my Oklahoma history class began with the land run. I've said this time and time again, that a lot of the work we do at the Native American Journalists Association is making up for those gross inadequacies in our public education system. So I don't really expect a lot of reporters to do a good job when they start off in Indian country with the wrong roadmap, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. Francine, you did the media circuit about this story. I'm curious, what struck you as particularly offensive when you read the story?
Well, I gotta say that I felt a bit defensive of Inuit when I read it, and I think that goes back to the many years that I've worked here on APTN. When we started our newsroom, we had to navigate how we're going to cover Inuit, how we're going to cover various nations from the East Coast to the Mi'kmaq Nation, to the West Coast, to the Gitxsan, and I felt that that defensive feeling because the globe or the global audience that the New York Times has, and the authoritative tone that they present their stories in, it really felt to me like we are going to tell the world what Indigenous life is like in Canada. And they went so far as to say that poverty defines Indigenous life in Canada. And that, I think, was the strongest thing in the piece that really got to me.
Well, and as a Métis woman reading this, anytime you see international coverage of something here and it's about our people, you look and say, like, again, how do I feel about this? I'm not Inuit, obviously, but I felt that same sort of, that there was a disservice that was done. You know, kind of the tone that's taken by the reporter. There was a little bit of a, I've done my homework and I know this history, but it's not a fulsome history. It was, and it's not even necessarily accurate. So you're framing your story as though it's an accurate historical representation that would lead up to what's happening in Cape Dorset today, but those facts weren't correct. So you worry as people read this who don't know the history. I'm thinking as an Indigenous person, people are reading this and believing this to be true because of how she framed it. I'm curious, what was the reaction because Naja, I should back up, Naja had called publicly for an audit of this story. What was the reaction from the New York Times when you said?
Well, the New York Times reached out to us right away, and they agreed to meet with us, and we met with them. We sat down, our Naja executive sat down with editors from the New York Times, and we really spent quite a few minutes just sort of looking at perspectives. They had their perspective when they read it, and we had ours, and there was no overcoming that. So we really had to just agree that we do have different perspectives when reading this. They did acknowledge that they tried to cover too much, and it lacked focus. But we did agree that this is something we both organizations want to work on and to keep those lines of communication open. And you know, they were going to look back at some of the reporters' notes to see if there's another story that they could possibly do that would offer more context. I mean, to have them acknowledge that they tried to cover too much and that it lacked focus, that was I think a big step.
Yeah.
But also there's, ever since the meeting has occurred, they reached out to Graham, and you know, they're looking for some advice on one of the next stories that they're going to be working on. So that is also a good sign coming out of this.
Yeah, Graham. So what did they have to say to you when they're looking ahead, going, let's do. We're not going to admit that what we did was wrong, but what could we do better? What are they looking for you or to you for help for, and what advice did you offer them?
You know, I think one of the problems that papers like the New York Times often have is that not only do they not hire journalists who are Indigenous to cover their own communities, which I understand can be difficult to build those sources, to make those contacts, but it can be done. But when even that's not done, typically a national publication will drop into Indian country when there's a tragedy, and there's something terrible that has happened, and they report on it and leave. And one of the things that we really stressed in our meeting to them, and I do believe that they really were listening when we said it, was that you should be present in these communities for more than just tragedy. You do that for all the other communities that you cover. You know, we always say, you know, go to a couple of funerals, go to a couple of protests, go to a couple of weddings, go to a couple of basketball games. You don't have to write about all those things, but just show those communities that you want to be there for something more than to just mine a story like a resource and take it and leave. Especially when that story is damaging about violence or tragedy, and something that can, like the story we've been talking about, reflect an entire community in a negative light, and sometimes place blame on that community for some of the problems that they're facing, which gets back to that historical context that I mentioned earlier, that, you know, if we put those things in place, if we show complexity of a community, I think it gives a better picture of who those people are. You know, Francine mentioned this earlier, you know, that the New York Times has an incredible scope, incredible that we call them the paper record for a reason. And so I think when they fail in a community and that reporting is harmful, it's even more so because of their influence. And so, I think they acknowledge that responsibility.
Well, I have to say, I was so proud of Naja for coming out swinging against that, because this, oftentimes as Indigenous journalists, we see these things and we kind of talk amongst ourselves about, that didn't sit well with me, I didn't like that. But we journalists are the worst, I would say, for calling out bad journalism that we see. I would say we are the absolute worst. We protect this craft as though we are above making mistakes. So when I saw this article and felt kind of, and then saw Naja come out and say, no, like, I'm calling you on that, I was very proud. So kudos to both of you guys for that. Graham, you give lessons to newsrooms. I want to know, what do you tell reporters and editors when you go in there?
Well, a lot of it is best practices, some style tips, how to approach people. One of the things I stress is that we're often taught as journalists that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, and that doesn't really work in Indian country. You have to build respect and trust before you can go into those places and ask those questions and ask to tell those stories. I try to make the presentation a little personal, and because I'm Cherokee, and our tribe has been printing newspapers 25 years longer than the New York Times. Actually, I think it's 23, but I want to make to the point to people like that Indian people telling our own stories isn't something like strange or weird, and our communities aren't that strange or weird or different. And I really try to stress that it's very important that you show Indigenous people as the modern people that we are. There's no shortage of stock photos of Indigenous people that has to do with powwows and beadwork and colorful feathers and things like that. But that kind of color doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the story that you're telling in Indian country, but oftentimes it finds its way in there. So I think it's a problem of perception, understanding that this is a place that you can unpack and learn about just like any other place. It just takes more time. And it also takes confronting some stereotypes and myths that you might believe are true, that you were taught when you were a child, because like I mentioned earlier, you might not have learned them in school, and all you have to go off of are John Ford movies and things like that. So, it's a process. And I think sometimes it's really hard for us reporters, myself included, to admit when we're wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the process too, is saying this isn't personal. You were taught something inaccurate, and you need to unlearn that in order to better serve this community.
Absolutely.
Because none of us want to go into a community and do harm. We want to be a mirror to that society, and more often than not in Indian country, reporters fail at that. And so I think there is progress, but it just takes a lot of time.
Getting over our own giant egos is the first step towards getting closer to fixing what's wrong with the media. Naja had put out a bingo card, which I loved. I saw that the Investigative Reporters and Editor Conference that was held in Houston, Texas last year. I saw this for the first time. I was there with a bunch of my colleagues from APTN, and we were just tickled to see this. Tell us about the card, Graham, and how it works and why you made it. Well, we're showing the audience the card right now, too, as you tell us about it.
Yes. So I have to give credit where credit's due. My editor over at High Country News, Tristan Ottone, who's Kiowa, and our president, Naja, was the one who really developed this. He would tell you it's just because he loves bingo, but really it does serve a good purpose, right? It's basically, you can look at this and take your story from Indian country, and you can say, if I got a bingo, then I'm using way too many stereotypes in my story. A lot of time, a story about Indian country will rattle off a lot of stereotypes as a way to define a community. And so sometimes a story will just fill the board. Other times you might not quite get a bingo, but you might want to relook at some of the language you're using, some of the things that you're pointing to as examples, and ask yourself, are they really necessary?
Can we see the bingo card again while Graham's still talking there? I just want to make sure that our audience can see some of what's on there to make a bingo. And this is something that reporters, as you're telling your story, whether it's at the pitch portion of here's a story I want to tell, or whether this is the research portion before you get out into the community, or when you're there, look at these boxes. Like, are you checking off or dabbing any of these stereotypes? And, maybe check your work against something like this. Francine, you did the bingo card when you went through the New York Times story.
Yeah, those are actually my dabs that showed up on the screen there. And I had to do this. I printed out the article. I was tasked with drafting our statement. And so I really wanted to make sure that I was getting the full picture and that we were going about it the right way. And so I had the card, I had the article, and as I read each paragraph, I was hitting
With your APTN bingo dabber?
With my APTN bingo dabber. I have to add, though, that this article, it was very troubling because there were extra bonus bingo squares that came out of this one that we don't have printed on the card.
What are they?
Domestic abuse, teenage pregnancy, and welfare. And the vanishing culture in this story was, a vanishing way of life as presented by the New York Times.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was what helped me, frame where all the stereotypes were laced into the story.
I want to talk a bit about that there are some help for you've discovered this as in your time as a journalist, that there is some help for people, whether you are Indigenous in media or you are non-Indigenous in media, and you're covering an Indigenous person or people or a community or a certain issue that involves Indigenous people. Yeah. Tell us what you have found that you found helpful.
Well, I found the elements of Indigenous style. I'll show you this in just a second, but this is by Gregory Younging, and as I go through here, there's notes about following Indigenous protocols, which are very important when you're entering a community, when you're talking to various nations. I also wanted to note that there is a good chapter on terminology, and even going so far as to note where capitalization is necessary when you're talking and writing about Indigenous people. And also the way we use Inuit and or Inuk. I know through my searches on Twitter that someone stopped reading the New York Times article when they read Inuit people.
Yes,
because you
it's
don't
redundant.
need it is, yeah. You just say Inuit. But I also found in this guide, and it was something I was thinking about when I knew I was going to come on the show, is the terminology and how we use these words like Aboriginal or Indigenous. And I remember a point in my career here, and I heard a colleague say she heard her son identify as Aboriginal, and he's a Anishinaabe and Cree. And Cindy Blackstock tweeted this to InFocus. It is important, and it is something that we've strived to do here at APTN, is to make sure our terminology is on point.
Yeah.
And I think some examples from this show came from Carmen talking about the Colton Bushi and how media described him as an Indigenous man.
Yes.
And when we looked at how we were going to frame and report on that, we went with a Cree youth.
Yeah.
Because that's really and truly
in his community, he's a Cree
youth.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so those the feedback that you've got, the guides that we have out there, through Naja, through Gregory Younging, and through various other journalists, they're readily available and can help any newsroom and any journalist, whether Indigenous or not.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but I want to point out, just further to what Francine was saying, Naja has kind of a checklist too on its website. I believe it's najanewsroom.com, and it kind of outlines some of the pitfalls of reporting on Indigenous people, how you can go through. This is from the checklist that we're seeing here right now. This is actually from Duncan McHugh, our friend over at CBC. He's done a whole website called Reporting in Indigenous Communities. That's RIIC.ca, and he's got a checklist here that reporters can go through. Now, if there's things that we can learn as Indigenous reporters or editors, certainly there's lots to be learned for our non-Indigenous counterparts. I would encourage everybody to check out Naja's website. That's najanewsroom.com, or Duncan McHugh's work that he's done here at RIIC.ca. I want to ask, I'll give this last one to you, Graham. So what is an easy fix to do better really quickly for media, whether you're on either side of the border?
Hire Indigenous journalists.
Hire?
I think, I understand that small newsrooms, the last job I had was a newspaper job, and we had layoffs every year I was there. I get it. But I think for a lot of, especially national newsrooms, if they want their newsrooms to be diverse, they will.
Yeah.
It's really, I don't see it any different than that. I think if they want to make their newsrooms have diverse voices, then they will have diverse voices. And so, honestly, I think that's the thing I would like to see the most, is just hiring Indigenous journalists to tell those stories.
Awesome. Francine, you would agree?
I have to echo that, and honestly, I was asked that question by another journalist, and I could not think of another answer, and I couldn't even come up with an excuse.
Okay. Well, that is all the time that we have for today. I thank you guys for joining us, Francine and Graham, from the Native American Journalists Association. This is something, too, this is an agency. If you see something at home that strikes you as not right in the media, you want to contact NAJA. They're here for us. It was a great conversation that we had here today, and I thank all of our guests for sharing their perspectives. This episode will be available for a download as a podcast on our website at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you back here next week.